They told us debt builds nations, that borrowing fuels growth, that progress needs leverage, and leverage needs lenders. But they never told us who owns the ladder. Because somewhere between promise and payment, a trick was played. A trick so old, so elegant, that every nation fell for it and called it economics. It began as a tool of trade, a way to borrow tomorrow from today. But over centuries, it became something else entirely, a system of quiet obedience. The coins changed, the names changed, but the mechanism stayed the same. You work, you earn, you owe, and the cycle spins, not to build prosperity, but to preserve control. Nations borrow to survive, governments tax to repay, citizens labour to sustain the illusion that any of it ends. They call it growth, they call it progress, but in truth it's a masterpiece of dependence, because real power doesn't conquer by force, it conquers by promise. And every time we sign, we surrender, not to kings or armies, but to numbers. The numbers we trust, the numbers we worship, the numbers that tell us we're free, as long as we can pay for it. This is the trick that made every nation poor. A story not about money, but about control, disguised as prosperity. Before coins ever clinked in a purse, there was a promise. A farmer owed grain to his neighbour. A tribe owed tribute to its chief. A ruler owed mercy to his people. Debt wasn't born in banks, it was born in trust, in the sacred bond between giver and receiver. But trust can be measured, and once measured, it can be monetized. In ancient Babylon, clay tablets recorded who owed what. Not out of greed, but out of memory. Debt was how civilization kept score, and soon those scores became power. Priests and kings realized something divine. If you can define what is owed, you can define what is right. They sanctified obligation. They gave it symbols, seals, and signatures. A debt was no longer between two people. It was between man and authority. And that changed everything. Because when morality becomes math, justice becomes balance, and balance becomes interest. The first interest rates were not economic. They were moral punishments. To borrow was to sin. To repay was to be redeemed. And so, debt became faith, a ritual of repentance, a structure of obedience. Empires learned to weaponize it. Kings financed wars with promises. Peasants mortgaged their freedom for safety. And slowly the idea spread that to be in debt was not failure, it was participation. That to owe was to belong. The tablets turned to parchment, the parchment turned to ledgers, and the ledgers turned to law. Debt was no longer a transaction. It was a tradition. A quiet machine humming beneath every throne, every market, every prayer for stability. A machine that turned faith into finance and obedience into order. And from that silence, the first bankers were born, priests of a new religion. A religion without gods, without grace, but with the same demand: believe, borrow, repay. Because long before we trusted money, we trusted debt. By the dawn of the modern age, gold was no longer just wealth, it was weaponry. And those who could lend it ruled those who could not. The age of discovery was not fueled by courage, it was financed by credit. Ships left harbours with royal flags, but their sails were paid for by bankers. The oceans weren't conquered by explorers, they were leased by investors. Because every empire begins the same way, with a promise to repay. Spain borrowed to chase gold. Britain borrowed to build ships. France borrowed to fight them both. And the lenders? They didn't care who won, they only cared that someone owed. When colonies were discovered, they came with interest rates attached. For every port built, a bond was issued. For every war waged, a loan was signed. The king's crown was collateral. The people's labour was payment. Debt had become destiny. Empires didn't just tax their subjects, they mortgaged their future. The battlefield moved from land to ledger. The sword gave way to the signature. And soon the greatest power on earth wasn't a nation, it was the creditor. While generals drew maps, bankers drew contracts. And the boundaries of civilization shifted to match their balance sheets. The British East India Company didn't conquer Asia, it financed it. A private company with an army, a bank with a flag. It collected taxes, controlled trade, and dictated politics in the name of commerce. But behind every trade wind there was a current, and that current was credit. From London to Calcutta, from Amsterdam to the Caribbean, money flowed like empire itself, outward, downward, and always with interest. And as the colonies grew, so did their chains. Nations began to resemble their subjects, borrowing to survive, paying to exist. By the 18th century, credit was no longer a tool of kings, it was the crown itself. Because true empire doesn't need conquest, it needs compliance. And compliance can always be bought. The world learned that lesson well. From the merchants of Venice to the traders of London, to the financiers who would one day redraw the entire globe, the map of power was no longer written in blood. It was written in debt. By the 19th century, the world had learned the oldest rule in finance. Power belongs not to the rich, but to those who decide what richness means. Gold had limits, trust did not. And so, new temples rose, not of marble and saints, but of marble and signatures. The Bank of England, the Banque de France, the Federal Reserve. Their creed was simple: stability, order, confidence. But their scripture was control, because money was no longer anchored in metal, it was anchored in belief. And belief, if managed carefully, could move entire nations. Central banks didn't just manage economies, they managed emotion. They learned to make panic profitable, to turn fear into stimulus, and to balance the illusion of independence with the reality of coordination. They called it policy. History calls it design. Every crisis birthed new power. Every collapse justified new control. In 1907, when markets panicked, the US built a central bank to protect the people. In 1929, when the system broke, they rebuilt it with even fewer checks. And in 2008, when greed burned the world again, they didn't dismantle the fire. They just printed more fuel. Because the greatest trick of central banking was never about creating money. It was about creating dependence. When they lower rates, you borrow. When they raise them, you beg. They control your mortgage, your savings, your nation's future. Not by force, but by formula. Inflation became the tax no one voted for. Debt became the policy no one could escape. And growth became the moral excuse for manipulation. Governments pretend to rule, markets pretend to choose. But both wait for one signal, from a boardroom few have ever seen. They don't wear crowns, they don't wave flags, they hold press conferences, and yet every syllable they speak can shake the price of your home, your job, and your life. Because central banks are not about money, they are about obedience. Obedience to cycles, to inflation, to the rhythm of artificial scarcity, and that obedience feels safe until it doesn't. Because once you believe that stability requires control, you'll accept any control in the name of stability. And that is the illusion. The illusion that they print wealth, when in truth, they print belief. When the world rebuilt after war, it didn't rebuild freedom, it rebuilt financing. The ashes of conflict gave birth to new institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the quiet architects of global obedience. They spoke the language of salvation, aid, relief, recovery. But behind every promise was a payment plan. Nations once ruled by empires now ruled by interest rates. Colonies became countries, but their debts never won independence. Because the age of conquest wasn't over, it just changed its paperwork. Loans replaced legions, agreements replaced armies, and the battlefield became the balance sheet. They called it foreign aid. But aid with interest isn't help, it's hierarchy. Every development loan came with strings attached, cuts to social programs, open markets for Western goods, and currency controls to ensure compliance. The debtor nations were told to modernise, to privatise, to globalise. And so they did, not by choice but by condition. The richer they borrowed, the poorer they became. The more they opened their markets, the more they lost control of them. By the 1980s, the global south was no longer colonised by flags. It was colonised by spreadsheets. A nation could elect its leaders, but it couldn't elect its creditors. And those creditors decided everything: its wages, its welfare, its worth. Behind every IMF loan stood a promise of stability. Behind that promise stood austerity. And behind austerity stood hunger, because the debt machine doesn't feed nations. It farms them. It keeps them just alive enough to pay and just desperate enough to borrow again. And when the cycle turns, it isn't the lenders who suffer. It's the workers, the farmers, the children. Whole generations trading education for repayment, hospitals for balance sheets, hope for interest. And all the while, the architects smile, calling it progress. But there's nothing progressive about poverty on schedule, because every loan is a leash, and the longer it extends, the tighter it pulls. This is not economics. It's empire disguised as generosity. The same empires that once took land by force now take futures by debt, and every time they lend, they remind the world who still owns it. Some chains rattle, others hum. Ours hum, quietly, rhythmically, to the sound of payments. Debt no longer feels like bondage. It feels like belonging. A student loan isn't slavery, it's investment. A mortgage isn't servitude, it's home ownership. A credit card isn't control, it's freedom. They changed the language and the mind followed, because the perfect system of control is the one you're grateful to serve. We measure success by what we can borrow, we measure worth by what we can buy, and we call it freedom because we can choose our own masters. The modern citizen doesn't fight for liberation. He refinances it. He doesn't revolt against power. He subscribes to it, monthly. The world of finance learned something that tyrants never could. Chains made of paper hold tighter than chains made of steel. Because steel breaks, contracts don't. And so, we live in the soft tyranny of comfort, addicted to convenience, dependent on credit, and convinced it's progress. We work not to earn, but to maintain, to stay good in the eyes of an algorithm, to keep our score, our status, our solvency. Debt became our citizenship, our membership in modern civilization, and for every digital tap, every automatic payment, the machine hums louder. It doesn't need to command us anymore. It only needs to remind us that everything we use, everything we touch, everything we believe we own, is rented from the system that owns us, even our time, even our trust. We were told that debt builds character. It built compliance. We were told that growth builds freedom. It built fatigue. We were told we were the masters of the market. But the market mastered us. Because the greatest victory of the debt machine wasn't economic. It was psychological. It convinced us that obedience is security, that submission is stability, that poverty is personal failure, but profit is divine. And so we praise the system that confines us. We defend the very structure that drains us. We fear collapse, not because it would destroy us, but because it would free us. Because freedom now feels dangerous, and dependence feels safe. They taught us to love our own chains, and worse, to call them opportunity. In the end, the greatest empire ever built had no flag, no anthem, no army, just numbers and belief. The debt machine didn't conquer the world. It convinced it. It turned trust into policy, promise into power, and obedience into currency. Every system we live in, every paycheck, every loan, every tax, is a hymn to that belief. A belief that control is necessary, that order is safety, that progress requires debt. But nations don't run on debt, they run on trust. And trust, once owned, is no longer trust. We were told that borrowing builds the future. It only postponed it. We were told that debt empowers people. It only binds them more elegantly. Because the true genius of this system is not that it imprisons us, but that it convinces us we're free. We decorate our cages with credit cards. We celebrate our servitude with subscriptions. We call our captivity growth. The world didn't lose its freedom to tyrants. It leased it, with flexible terms and variable interest. And every generation signs the renewal. So the question isn't who owns the debt. The question is who still believes in it. Because the moment we stop believing, the machine stops humming. The illusion stops spinning. And the world remembers that money was never the measure of value, only of obedience. If this gave you a new perspective, don't just scroll away, hit subscribe. This is Economic Chronicles, where history exposes the present and the future is written in the lessons we refuse to learn.